the surface illusion. You know what the most dangerous thing in Formula One is? It's not a driver pushing too hard in the rain or a team making a strategic gamble that backfires. The most dangerous thing is assuming that what you're seeing on the surface tells you the complete story. And right now, as we watch Max Verstappen trail Oscar Piastri by 40 points with 5 races remaining, almost everyone is making that exact mistake. They're looking at the championship table and seeing a genuine fight between two drivers, where either could win depending on who executes better over these final weeks. But if you understand what's actually happening underneath those numbers, you already know how this championship ends. And it's not even close. Let me take you back to Zandvoort, Max's home race, just a few weeks ago. Piastri had just extended his championship lead to 104 points over Verstappen. Think about that gap for a moment. 104 points with less than half the season remaining. Max himself said that if someone told him in that moment he'd be fighting for the championship, he would have called them an idiot. The media was writing articles about the end of Red Bull's dominance. Everyone was analyzing which seat Max might take for the following season because surely Red Bull couldn't fix their car problems in time to salvage this championship. The narrative was set. Max was done. McLaren had finally arrived. The sport was about to crown new champions. Except none of that was actually true. The technical masterclass nobody noticed. What everyone was seeing was point totals and race results, but they weren't seeing the structural dynamics that determine how championships actually get won and lost. And those dynamics were telling a completely different story, one that pointed to Max Verstappen winning his 5th consecutive title through a combination of advantages that McLaren simply cannot match no matter how fast their car is. The mainstream story about the summer break is that Red Bull brought upgrades to the front wing and floor that fixed the car, and suddenly Max was fast again. But that explanation misses the entire point of what actually occurred. What happened was that Red Bull and Verstappen executed the most sophisticated driver feedback loop in modern Formula One, and the speed and precision of that execution reveals why they're still the team to beat. Think about what Max was doing during that horrible first half of the season when he was complaining about the car constantly, even when he was winning races. He wasn't just whining or venting frustration, he was providing incredibly detailed technical feedback about exactly what the car was doing wrong at specific points on every single circuit. He was describing how the car rotated in medium speed corners, where the aerodynamic balance shifted under braking, what the rear end was doing on corner exit. Most Formula One drivers can tell you something feels wrong, but they can't diagnose the aerodynamic phenomena causing that sensation. Max can. He was essentially functioning as a mobile sensor gathering data that telemetry cannot capture because it's about the subjective experience of driving at the absolute limit, where tiny differences in feel translate to huge differences in lap time. Red Bull's engineers took all of that feedback and reverse engineered the aerodynamic problems causing those sensations. They figured out that the floor was generating inconsistent downforce depending on ride height and yaw angle, creating unpredictable balance. The front wing wasn't generating consistent load through the full steering range, so the car's behavior changed mid-corner in ways that destroyed driver confidence. And then comes the part that should absolutely terrify McLaren. The moment those parts were installed, Max went to Monza and set the fastest qualifying lap in Formula One history. Not the fastest lap of the weekend, not the fastest of the season, the fastest lap in 75 years of Formula One. He didn't need 3 weekends to understand the new aero characteristics. He didn't need to slowly build confidence. He immediately extracted maximum performance from those upgrades in his very first qualifying session with them. That level of technical understanding between driver and engineering team is something you cannot replicate quickly. It's built over years of working together, and it's an advantage that compounds every single race weekend. McLaren's self-inflicted paralysis. Now contrast that with what's happening at McLaren, and you'll understand why their organizational structure is actually a hidden weakness. McLaren is running what they call the papaya rules, where both drivers have equal status and equal access to everything. On the surface, this sounds fair and sporting, but what it actually reveals is that McLaren genuinely doesn't know which of their drivers is better. And that's not a philosophical choice about fairness, that's an admission that neither driver has demonstrated the consistent dominance that would make the hierarchy obvious. When Piastri and Norris give conflicting feedback about the car, which happens constantly because they have different driving styles, McLaren's engineers have to compromise. They can't optimize completely for one driver's technique because they've committed to treating both equally. So their development direction is inherently slower and less targeted than Red Bull's approach, where every technical decision flows through one simple question. Does this make Max Verstappen faster? But the papaya rules have created an even bigger problem now that the championship is tightening. McLaren desperately needs to consolidate points behind one driver to defend against Max's charge. Everyone can see that's the optimal strategy, but they can't do it without contradicting their season-long promise and admitting their approach was wrong. Andrea Stella has said publicly and emphatically that there will be no team orders. There's a concept in decision-making research called escalation of commitment, where organizations keep investing in a failing strategy because reversing course requires admitting the initial decision was wrong. That's exactly what's happening at McLaren right now. They committed to the papaya rules when it seemed low cost because they expected to dominate. But now that commitment has become enormously expensive. Every race where Piastri and Norris split points instead of consolidating them is a race where Max closes the gap. Yet reversing course means McLaren's leadership has to publicly admit they made a strategic error, which is psychologically difficult even when the data clearly shows it's necessary. So they'll keep delaying that decision, hoping it resolves itself, and that delay is the gift that keeps giving for Verstappen because time is the one resource McLaren is running out of while Red Bull has perfect strategic clarity. Championship DNA versus championship dreams. That's Verstappen's first decisive advantage, organizational alignment that McLaren cannot match. But the second advantage is even more important because it's about championship mentality and psychological regulation under pressure. The mainstream narrative about the first half of the season was that Max was struggling and frustrated, that the pressure was getting to him. But if you understand championship psychology, his behavior revealed exactly the opposite. Elite competitors don't accept suboptimal performance. His vocal criticism of the car was him refusing to normalize mediocrity, maintaining championship standards even when the machinery wasn't delivering championship performance. And while Max was complaining, he was still winning races. He was still extracting results that exceeded what the car should have delivered. Compare that with Oscar Piastri's trajectory. He had the best car on the grid for months, yet he couldn't convert that advantage into a commanding lead. 104 points sounds substantial until you realize with McLaren's pace advantage it should have been much larger. And now that pressure is increasing, we're seeing errors that reveal his psychological state. The jump start in Baku shows he's overthinking procedures. The collision with Norris and Austin shows he's getting defensive and territorial. The lack of podiums since Monza shows he's not executing under pressure. But what should really worry McLaren is that we've seen this exact pattern before. Last season, at this precise point in the calendar, Piastri collapsed. 8th in Mexico, 8th in Brazil, 7th in Las Vegas. These are the exact same circuits coming up right now. The pattern is too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Something about either these specific track characteristics or the accumulated late-season pressure exposes weaknesses in his driving or preparation. Meanwhile, Max has shown the opposite trajectory. When the car was difficult, he remained competitive through force of will. Now that it's improved, he's immediately elevated to record-breaking performance. Helmut Marko noted that Max is smiling again, not shouting over the radio. That's a champion with complete emotional control operating in the psychological state where his performance peaks. The calendar conspiracy and inevitable conclusion. The third advantage is the calendar itself, and when you look at each remaining circuit individually, the pattern becomes overwhelming. Mexico's high altitude creates unique aero conditions that suit Red Bull's philosophy, emphasizing mechanical grip and engine performance where they've traditionally excelled. Max won there last year without the fastest car. Brazil is arguably his strongest circuit, rewarding drivers comfortable with unstable rear ends and changing grip, core signatures of Max's driving style. Las Vegas will likely see Mercedes stronger than McLaren, meaning George Russell takes points from Piastri and Norris, even if Red Bull isn't fastest. Qatar is where Max won last year in an inferior car. And then everything culminates in Abu Dhabi, where Max has explicitly said anything can happen in a final race. That's psychological warfare, reminding everyone he won a championship on the last lap there. You're not looking at 5 random circuits. You're seeing a sequence of tracks specifically favoring Verstappen's driving style, Red Bull's technical package, and the psychological advantage of a multiple champion versus drivers competing for their first. So when you tie these 3 advantages together, organizational clarity enabling faster execution, championship mentality delivering performance under pressure, and a remaining calendar suiting his strengths, you understand why the 40-point gap isn't a meaningful obstacle. These advantages compound over multiple races, meaning the performance gap will keep shifting in his favor with increasing momentum. Max will win at least 3 of the remaining 5 races. Piastri will have at least 1 more podium finish. McLaren won't announce team orders before Mexico because doing so requires admitting their strategy was wrong, and by the time they overcome that organizational paralysis, it'll be too late. Why you already know how this ends, you can verify this analysis by watching for specific markers. If Piastri wins 2 of the next 3 races without significant errors, then my assessment of his psychological fragility is wrong. If McLaren announces team orders before Mexico and successfully consolidates points, then my argument about organizational paralysis is incorrect. If Red Bull's pace advantage disappears at Mexico and Brazil where it should be strong historically, then the summer upgrades weren't as fundamental as argued. But I don't expect any of those conditions to materialize because these structural dynamics aren't based on hope. They're based on organizational theory and championship psychology that have proven predictive across multiple seasons. Max Verstappen will win his 5th consecutive world championship. When he does, people will call it an incredible comeback from an impossible deficit, but it was never impossible. The organizational clarity, championship mentality, favorable calendar, these advantages were visible the entire time to anyone paying attention to the right indicators. The 40-point gap was always just an artifact of accumulated results that didn't reflect underlying structural reality. This is why you remained confident when everyone said his era was over. You understood that championships aren't won by having the fastest car for a few months. They're won by having the complete package of driver talent, organizational alignment, and psychological resilience sustained over an entire season. Verstappen and Red Bull have that complete package. McLaren has a fast car and talented drivers, but they lack the organizational clarity and championship experience to defend a lead under pressure from a driver of Verstappen's caliber. So watch these final races with confidence, because you understand dynamics others are missing. The numbers will eventually catch up to what structural analysis already revealed. Max Verstappen has already won this championship. The remaining races will simply confirm what the data has been saying all along.